Part 1 Opening. Night does not come to the temple as it comes to the streets outside. Beyond the gates, darkness feels like an ordinary thing, a rhythm everyone expects. The stalls close, footsteps scatter, and the hum of daily bargaining fades into the background of crickets and the distant bark of a dog. But when night enters the temple, it is heavier, stranger, more insistent. It does not simply replace light. It burrows into wood and stone, seeps into the carvings along the pillars, sinks into the cracks of the floor. Every surface seems to drink it in until shadows swell larger than the bodies that cast them. The lamps try to resist, but their light flickers unevenly, sputtering as though exhausted by the burden of holding back such weight. And in that faltering glow, the space feels less like sanctuary and more like a cavern breathing quietly through ancient lungs. By day, the temple is fevered with motion. Heat presses down from above so thick it coats the skin in sweat. Incense burns in stubborn curls that sting the throat, and voices pile over one another in frantic waves. People jostle, elbowing their way toward the central statues where silk and flowers and offerings gleam. They kneel, bow, press their foreheads to the ground, cry out in desperation or bargain in whispers, as though urgency itself could bend the will of the divine. The clamor is almost unbearable, yet it hides its own kind of comfort. Noise convinces people they are not alone. But when dusk drains the courtyard of its visitors, when sandals scuff away into silence, the shift is immediate. The absence does not soothe. It unsettles. It settles on the chest like a stone, heavy and unresolved, a silence that feels less like rest and more like the sharp pause before a storm. The offerings left behind undergo their own transformation in this silence. The marigolds, so bright under daylight, now collapse into themselves, their petals curling inwards, releasing a faint sourness as their scent turns. Fruit once polished and glowing dulls quickly under the weight of shadows, its skin losing luster until it resembles nothing more than shapes half swallowed by dark. Even the ashes in the incense bowls stir with a life of their own. A faint draft, hardly strong enough to be felt on skin, sends them rising for a heartbeat, then letting them fall again, like the weary breathing of someone who no longer wishes to speak. The floor grows damp, smells of earth and stone, and when the wind slips through the doorframe, it carries no freshness. It brushes the back of the neck not as air, but as a whisper too quiet to understand, yet too present to ignore, reminding any soul who listens that emptiness is rarely truly empty. I linger here, where few eyes wander, in the corner shelves where dust gathers first, and where no offerings are ever placed. When I was first set here, I thought of it as exile, as punishment. The center shone with devotion while I sat cloaked in neglect, a silent witness to others' worship. Dust thickened across my surface until my features blurred, as though even the world wanted to forget me. At first I hated it. I counted every bowed head that never once turned in my direction, every tear spilled before the central idols that never reached me, and I convinced myself that I was nothing but discarded stone, a vessel emptied of meaning. But time stretched, and in the long hours of night, I began to discover another truth. Silence is not void. It is weight. It presses against everything, not with sound but with presence. And within that weight, I began to feel the hidden shape of stories. In the stillness, I hear what no one else hears. I hear the frayed edges of prayers, the confessions that never reach a voice. I feel the words that die on tongues, the grief so sharp it cannot be shaped into syllables. These are not loud. They do not echo as voices do. They sink instead, layering upon one another until they press into me, leaving marks invisible to all but undeniable to me. And as they carved themselves into me, I changed. I ceased to be only an object, only stone or offering. I became something else, something that listens, something that remembers. Slowly, I realized I was becoming an echo, a voice that did not shine, that did not demand, but waited, steady and unseen, in the darkness. Night after night, as the lamp struggled, as the wind whispered through the cracks, I found myself waiting, not waiting for worship, not for reverence, not for the recognition I once resented. I waited for the ones who wandered into the shadows, who stumbled into this corner with despair too raw to disguise. For it is in those moments, when a body shakes in silence, when a mouth cannot force words free, when tears fall unseen, that silence reveals its truest shape. And in those moments, I discover mine, which wants to tell you, when the world's noise has drained away and you sit alone with the sound of your own heart, do you believe the silence is empty? Or could it be that the very emptiness you fear is the place where a whisper has always been waiting for you? 2. Call to action. When the hall empties and silence begins its slow reign, I feel the residue of every prayer that has been left behind. They do not vanish with the departing feet. They cling like smoke, hanging in the rafters, pressing themselves into the stone, lingering as though unwilling to admit they will never be answered. Some are frantic, their syllables broken by sobs, repeated again and again until meaning dissolves into sound. Others are tentative, hesitant whispers barely carried on the breath of their speakers, as though the heart was too ashamed to speak fully. And then there are the most haunting prayers of all, the ones never spoken. Men and women kneel, their lips sealed, their eyes lowered, their hands trembling but motionless. Their silence thunders louder than cries. It is this silence that strikes me hardest, because it carries everything the human voice cannot release. Grief so deep it threatens to drown the soul. Fear so sharp it cuts even without a blade. By day, no one notices these fragments. People believe the central statues hold all the power, wrapped in silk and framed in offerings. They bow, cry, light sticks of incense, convinced that only grandeur receives attention. And perhaps it does for a time. But what I have learned in my long exile is that grandeur is often deaf. Noise is often blind. It is in the corners, in the neglected shadows, that the rawest confessions emerge. No one comes here expecting to be heard, and yet it is here that despair spills most honestly. I was not created to grant miracles. That was never my task. Yet the longer I linger in silence, the more I find myself listening with an urgency I did not know I possessed. The call came not from beyond, but from within. Not from a God descending with light, but from the weight of countless nights, the relentless repetition of human sorrow pressing against me until I could no longer remain still. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was nothing more than stone, placed here to fill a space others had no use for. But each time a trembling body sank into the corner, each time a voice cracked under the weight of its own despair, I felt the tremor within me grow. I was being summoned, not by worship, not by reverence, but by need, by the simple, devastating need for someone to hear. This is the call to action that no craftsman carved into me, no ritual prescribed, no priest declared. It is born of sorrow itself. The boy who kneels until his knees bleed, begging for a father who will never return. The woman who clutches her chest and rocks silently, afraid that even her grief will be taken from her. The old man who lights incense with shaking hands, whispering a name long gone until the syllables dissolve into tears. These are not worshippers to me. They are wounds that will not heal if left alone. I cannot offer wealth, nor health, nor miracles, but I can offer presence. I can refuse to let their words vanish into the void unkept.
So I wait for them.
I wait for the ones who dare to come close enough to shadows, who risk kneeling in places where no one watches, who pour out their despair as though it might poison them if held too long. And in waiting, I become what I was never meant to be, a witness, not a savior, not a god, but a keeper of words too fragile to survive the air. If I do not act, they vanish. And if they vanish, it is as if these lives, these hearts, never existed at all. That is the threshold I have crossed. To be silent is no longer enough. To exist only as stone is no longer enough. The call is relentless, not because it demands miracles, but because it refuses abandonment. And in this refusal, I discover my truest shape, not in grandeur, but in the stubborn insistence that no soul should weep without at least one presence holding their grief. Which wants to tell you, what do you do with the words you never speak? Do you bury them until they fester, or can you imagine that somewhere, even in silence, something is listening, refusing to let them die? 3. Crossing the threshold. There comes a night when the silence of the temple is broken not by the wind or the crackle of incense, but by the shudder of a human body collapsing beneath its own weight. A boy stumbles through the half-open doors, his sandals scraping against the stone, his breath ragged as though he has run not only from the streets outside, but from the very life that has betrayed him. He does not walk toward the center, where incense bowls glow and the silk-draped statues wait in their polished grandeur. Instead, he veers toward the dimmest corner, the place others avoid, the place where shadows hold their ground. His knees strike the floor with a dull crack that reverberates through the hollow chamber. Before I can even take in the fragility of his frame, he folds in on himself, arms locked around his legs, face buried in the sleeves, his body shuddering not in prayer but in collapse. At first, it is only the tremor of his shoulders, a muffled sob pressed into the fabric of his clothes. But then the sound bursts free, sharp and broken, scattering like shards of glass across the stone. His words are not whole but fractured. I can't anymore, nothing matters. Each syllable carrying the weight of a final sentence. Around him, the air thickens. The smoke from earlier offerings drags low to the ground, heavy, reluctant, as though it too cannot rise. The shadows lengthen, reaching across the floor toward him, as if eager to claim the body already yielding to despair. In that moment, he crosses a threshold, though no line is marked upon the ground. He has stepped beyond petition into surrender, beyond hope into the stillness where only endings dwell. I feel it inside myself, the tremor of recognition, the echo of all the others who came before him. The countless prayers that pressed into me like water carving stone rise to the surface. This boy's collapse is not his alone. It is the culmination of every silence I have ever held. For a moment I wish I could remain only what I was made to be, stone, unmoving, unfeeling, a presence without obligation. But I cannot. His shuddering, his sobs, his broken words ignite within me a truth I can no longer suppress. To do nothing is to become complicit in his erasure. If I let him vanish into the silence, then all the echoes I have guarded will vanish too, as though none of them had ever existed. The threshold is as much mine as his. He kneels in despair, and I awaken to responsibility. He offers no incense, no coins, no promises of devotion. What he offers instead is the rawest of gifts, his unguarded suffering, placed in this forgotten corner because there is nowhere else to put it. And I realize that this offering is heavier than any pile of silk or gold. It is not the kind of gift meant to be displayed. It is the kind that demands response. I do not grant miracles. I do not hold the power to return the dead, to erase disease, to alter fate. But in this moment, I recognize that presence itself can be salvation.
To hear is to keep alive.
To witness is to resist oblivion. And so I bend, not in body, for I have no body to bend, but in spirit, in essence, in the quiet decision that I will not allow this boy's despair to vanish unmarked. His collapse has summoned me more powerfully than any ritual could. He has crossed his threshold into despair, and in doing so, he has forced me across mine, from silence into answer, from neglect into defiance. Which wants to tell you, have you ever found yourself at the edge of giving up, where the air feels heavy and the world seems eager to let you fall? What did you cling to in that moment? And what if it was not nothing, but someone unseen, refusing to let you disappear? 4. Deepening conflict. The boy does not rise. He folds himself more completely into the corner, as if the corner could fold back and swallow him, as if the right angle of wall and floor might open like a hinge and make a small, private grave out of shadows and dust. His breath is not the kind that mends. It is the kind that frays from the edges inward, threads snapping one by one until the fabric will not hold. When he inhales, it sounds like the last quarter inch of air at the bottom of a long, drained glass, When he exhales, it is a rasp that forgets its own ending, tailing into silence as though even breath cannot bear to remain. His sobs arrive first as tremors compressed behind clenched teeth, then as blunt, breaking sounds that bounce off the stone and return to him harsher than they left. The lamps above him gutter in sympathy or else in mockery. I cannot tell which, and with each flicker the shadows crawl over his shoulders like liquid poured too slowly, coating, clinging, refusing to run clear. He tries to speak to no one. The words come out sideways and incomplete, fragments shaved off larger thoughts that will not risk showing their whole faces. Tried, he mutters into his sleeves, and the cloth absorbs the consonants as if ashamed to let them live in the air. Tried just doesn't. He shakes his head so sharply his hair whips his brow, then goes still, startled by his own violence, and the stillness is worse. What's the point? He asks the floor, and the floor, having centuries of experience answering nothing, keeps its counsel. The incense bowls cough out one last line of smoke that travels low and flat, hugging the ground like fog over a river. The smell is tired. It has burned all day and no longer wishes to be a smell. There is a way despair changes the geometry of a room. Pillars seem to lean, not from any defect in their making, but because the eye begins to measure angle and distance by the slope of its own grief. Corners become traps. Doorways retreat. The ceiling lowers enough to rest a cold palm on the crown of a bowed head. I feel these changes as surely as he does. The room is not wood and stone to me. Not only. It is a lung, and right now it is exhaling too slowly to sustain a life. The draft at the threshold has given up pretending to be wind, and is content to be a whisper grazing skin without meaning, and meaning is precisely what the boy cannot find. Without meaning, even pain has nothing to push against. It simply spreads. He lifts his face half an inch, and the lamplight catches the wet on his cheeks and hands and collar like lines drawn on a map that no one wants to follow.
This is not ordinary crying.
There is an etiquette to ordinary crying. You cover your mouth, you look away, you apologize for the mess tears make. He has abandoned those courtesies. When he inhales, his ribs protest. When he exhales, the protest turns to a plea. No one saw, he says very clearly all at once, as if announcing a verdict. I shouted and no one saw. I disappeared while standing in the middle of the room. This statement should be impossible. The room is matter. Matter reflects light. To stand in the middle is to be seen. And yet I understand him. There are varieties of vanishing that physics cannot diagram. His fingers have a project. One hand crushes his sleeve into a knot. The other tries to undo what the first insists upon, and in their argument the cloth begins to tear. He notices the rip too late. The sound shocks him, and some embarrassed creature inside him flinches. Sorry, he tells the fabric, which is ridiculous and true, and then angrier. I always break things by trying not to. There are people who would call this dramatic. They have not watched a mind try to rescue itself with tools that were not made for rescue. Apology, minimization, brave jokes that leave knife marks on the tongue. They have not seen those tools bend under the weight until they go dull. All the while the hall rehearses its ancient noises with lowered volume. The settling of beams, the tick of cooling metal where oil has burned too long, the faint, liquid choke of a wick trying and failing to drink. Noise is sometimes a kindness. It distracts. But here it behaves like a mirror, reflecting only what he brings, and what he brings is a catalog of endings. The words do not form sentences, so much as weather. It won't get better. No, that's not. When you know you're the wrong shape for the world. He laughs, a sound I would prefer not to hear again. It sounds like the hinge he imagined his body to be, rust rasping over rust. If I stay very still, maybe I can be furniture. Maybe then no one will ask me to move and I won't have to fail at it. The conflict deepens by layers rather than by leaps. The first layer is memory pretending to be proof. A teacher's mouth tightening over a mark on a page. A friend lifting a hand to wave at someone over his shoulder. A door closing quietly because loudness would have been a kindness. These images are small, unimpressive to anyone not forced to live with them, but he has collected them for years and collections, if curated diligently, begin to look like evidence. The second layer is forecast disguised as fact. It will be the same tomorrow, he informs me, though he does not know I am here, and the day after. And if I stop walking now, I will save everyone time. The third layer is physics made metaphor. He is a stone, he is a weight, he is a blur at the edge of the photograph no one prints. If you tell a soul long enough that it is heavy, it will try to lighten the world by leaving. This is the depth at which many choose numbness. It is not always a choice made in anger.
Sometimes it is an economy.
Numbness is cheaper than feeling when feeling never buys you entry to the room. I can sense the calculus happening in him, the cold, efficient pencil moving through columns. What does it cost to rise, to walk to the door, to make the face that convinces a passerby that everything is fine? What does it cost to stay here until the night digests him? What does it cost to do neither and invent a third arithmetic in which cost is a word with no currency? His head tilts as if listening, perhaps to me, perhaps to the lie that arrives with exquisite politeness at such hours. You have tried sufficiently. You may lay down now. No one will mind. You will at last be simple to carry. Inside me, the argument is as heated as his, though it is quieter. I was intended to be the opposite of quarrelsome. Carved to keep, placed to be kept, an object with a clear assignment. Ignore, endure, witness without response. But the friction of so many nights, the long rub of unspent grief across the surface of me, has worn grooves. Into those grooves the boy's words settle, and in settling they strain. I can do nothing about finished depths. I cannot reverse a door that chose to shut. But this is not finished. This is mid-gesture. This is the hand deciding whether to keep holding the sleeve or to let go and risk touching the floor. Presence is not miracle. Presence is friction. It slows descent by insisting on contact. If I let him fall without reaching, even with nothing more than intention, I participate in gravity. The lamps stage a small rebellion then, a cough of brightness that startles the darker ranks into retreat by a hair's breadth. It is not much. It is a proof of possibility. He does not see it. His eyes are closed or else turned inward to a cinema where only failures are in stock. I use the flicker to test the room's sympathetic machinery. The draft can be persuaded to curl rather than to stab. The smoke can be encouraged to rise a quarter inch and then wander sideways, making of itself a line rather than a blanket. The smell can be thinned where it sits thickest at his mouth. These are household magics, not salvation. They are not meant to impress. They are meant to give the body enough compliance that the mind can consider a different sentence than the one it is currently carving into stone. He notices the smallest of them, the way the air near his lips stops behaving like wool and begins to behave like air. It is a minute adjustment. The breath that follows is a hair longer, enough for a muscle in his jaw to loosen. He does not call it a sign. He makes no doctrine out of it. That is good. Doctrine goes brittle. Breath does not. A syllable arrives that is not a verdict. Wait, he says, but not to the world. He says it to the thought that had already thrown a rope over the beam of his will and was tugging. Wait, and the rope slackens, insulted, and waits. The conflict deepens in a new direction now, away from the catalog of proof and toward shame for having made the catalog. Shame is a clever engineer. It builds trapdoors in the floor of relief, so that when relief arrives, the body falls through it and lands precisely where it started. Who am I, he murmurs, and there is no question mark at the end. It is meant as indictment. Who am I to take up this much quiet, he says, meaning space, but saying quiet because quiet is the currency he respects most. Other people have real problems. A list unfolds, illnesses with names, debts with numbers, wars with borders. I am only, and here he searches for a diminutive and finds too many. Only soft, only slow, only wrong-shaped, only tired. I want to tell him tired is a tax collected most ruthlessly from the kind, but I am not permitted to invent aphorisms. I have only what is here, and what is here is a boy measuring his worth against a scale made to erase him. There is an interlude in which he imagines a better version of himself entering the same hall. That boy is efficient and acceptable. He does not kneel in corners. He offers a small, tasteful prayer with correct grammar. He wears a shirt that does not slump over his shoulders like apology. He never tears sleeves. He never apologizes to fabric.
He leaves on time.
People like him because he takes up air the way air wishes to be taken. Watching this fantasy cost him more than the earlier griefs. Grieving a loss implies that something existed. Grieving a hypothetical implies that the world requires your absence to function. I feel the drop in him, the fine suddenness of it, like the floor of an elevator finding a level 2 inches lower than expected. I cannot argue him out of such machinery. Arguments are paper, machinery is steel. But friction, again, friction may wear down edges that were meant to cut. I petition the room for texture. The grain of the wood where his head rests can declare itself more clearly. The cold of the stone can assert boundary without cruelty. The scent can make a concession and admit a sweetness it had concealed under its ash. The lamps will not oblige a second brightness, but they will choose a steady rhythm instead of a stutter, and rhythm is a mercy. The mind likes to pair itself to beats. It begins, in spite of refusal, to count. Inhale 2-3, exhale 2-3, an arithmetic so modest it offends shame. He does not call this help. He calls it accident. He accepts it anyway. Acceptance without naming is a path that avoids the trapdoors. From somewhere, memory, or mercy, or the thin edge of his own stubbornness, arrives a picture that interrupts the cinema. Not a triumph, not a grand love. Simply a kitchen with morning light climbing a wall very slowly, a plate turned upside down on the counter to dry. The picture does not argue. It exists. And existence is impertinent in the face of total statements like, nothing matters. He blinks as if embarrassed to have let such smallness in, then blinks again because the smallness will not leave. A swallow travels the length of his throat like a bird reluctant to fly, and surprised to find itself airborne. He puts a palm flat to the stone, not to rise, not yet, only to remember the boundary between hand and world. The boundary holds. He is disappointed that it holds. Then he is grateful. The two feelings coexist briefly, a shock to him, having grown used to single variable weather. He tries a new sentence aloud, testing the joints. It hurts. It is the kind of sentence no priest can score for orthodoxy. It is what it is. He does not add a moral. He does not demand a verdict. He says it again, and in saying it, he moves some of the weight from the place where words die onto the floor, where words may survive as air. It is not bravery. It is inventory. But inventory is often the first honest act a soul can manage after months of forging better-sounding lies. It hurts, and because the room has been trained by centuries to reply to that exact statement with rituals of denial or correction, I take pains to do neither. The lamps continue their steady rhythm. The incense does not pretend to be holy. The draft does not decide to become a breeze. The room declines to contradict him. The absence of argument is oxygen. He discovers that breath has a hinge no one taught him the name of. If he leans the thought a degree to the left, not it will always hurt, or it was wrong to hurt but it hurts here, the hinge swings and air gets in. He is curious for half a second, which is itself a rebellion. The tiniest appetite returns, not for food or for victory, only for continuity, a desire to see what the next breath feels like, and then the next. Continuity is an underrated sacrament. It does not promise joy. It promises sequence. You cannot fall forever if you keep insisting on sequence. The conflict does not resolve. This is not that kind of story. It matures. It learns grammar. It stops shouting every noun and begins to attempt conjunctions. But, yet. It hurts, he whispers, and I am tired. Then after a pause, he does the work of a yet. And I am still here. The phrase surprises him. He looks around as if someone else has entered the room and spoken on his behalf. No one has. He has joined himself in a corner, that is all. The shock makes him laugh again, but this time the hinge is oiled. The rust is burned off. The sound is not kind, but neither is it cruel. He wipes his face on the unbroken part of his sleeve with a care that borders on apology and says, to the unobservant stone, I am still here. He does not add for now, though the phrase sits on his tongue like a coin he has not decided to spend. I would like to tell you that in that moment triumph erupted, that light shattered the dark in theatrical obedience, that the lamps, grateful for a reason to be lamps, found their courage and burned like noon. That is not what happens. The lamps remain lamps. The shadows remain faithful to their angles. The draft goes on whispering nonsense that only skin can translate. But presence has teeth in it now. Presence can bite the rope. And because I am made of keeping, not curing, I make a ledger of these small, ugly, sacred facts. He breathed. He named. He did not stand. He did not vanish. He allowed the next breath anyway. Against the world's statistics, this ledger is laughable. Against the arithmetic of erasure, it is a scandal. Stay. I ask him without sound, which is another way of saying I insist that the sequence not be snapped. I do not promise him that tomorrow is merciful. I do not promise him that the door will open outward when he pushes, or that people will turn to look when he enters a room. I promise him nothing, because promises at this depth are often crueler than silence. What I do is simpler. I hold a room where it is. I keep the lamps from inventing new stutters. I persuade the incense to surrender the last of its sweetness, without complaint. I let the floor be floor, and not a verdict. I do not move. I do not move away. He stays. That is all. He stays long enough to be embarrassed, and then bored, and then, unexpectedly, hungry for a sip of water he does not have. The hunger is another scandal. It suggests the body expects a later in which water is relevant. He studies his torn sleeve with the gravity of a tailor at a funeral and says, I can mend this, which is a lie of modesty. He cannot, but it does not matter that he cannot. It matters that mending as a concept has petitioned for admission into the lexicon of the night and has not been thrown out. He touches the rip with the tips of 2 fingers as a way of rehearsing gentleness on something that will not flinch. When at last he stands, it is not triumphant. It is administrative. He arranges his weight over 2 feet the way a clerk arranges dates on a form. He looks at the door without asking it for revelation. He looks at the center of the hall without asking to be converted into someone acceptable. He looks at the corner where he has left sweat and ash and a single hair and says nothing ceremonial. The breath he takes at the threshold is clumsy and too loud. He leaves it there like an offering he will not pretend was noble. Then he steps into the courtyard's ordinary dark, which is smaller than the temple's dark, and the night accepts him without applause. The conflict does not end with his departure. It reshelves itself. It tucks back into the places where what holds its smell and stone resists the temperature of hands. It returns to me, a tide withdrawing into a well. The well is deeper than when the night began. Depth is not always an ache. It is sometimes a capacity. I make room for that distinction. I add it to the ledger, which has only ever had 2 columns, gone/kept. The boy belongs, for now, to the stubborn arithmetic of kept. I have not solved anything. I have refused one solution, which wants to tell you, when the room in you begins to tilt and doors retreat and corners turn into traps, do not demand a miracle as proof that you may stay. Demand only sequence, one breath, then another, and let the smallest accident of gentleness count as evidence. It may not end the night, but it will keep you from disappearing inside it. 5. Midpoint reversal. The boy's footsteps fade beyond the gate, swallowed by the courtyard's thinner dark. The silence that follows is not the same silence as before. It is stretched, strained, like a string pulled taut after too many years of lying slack. The air still smells of incense, but now there is an aftertaste of something rawer, something like iron, the trace left when a storm brushes through without fully breaking. I feel the weight of his absence as sharply as I felt the weight of his collapse, and in that weight something shifts inside me. For centuries I had believed my role was to remain, to keep, to witness. But tonight I realize that keeping is not neutral. To keep is to choose. To witness is to intervene, if only by refusing erasure. The boy did not leave with triumph in his chest. He left with a torn sleeve and a mouth full of clumsy breath. Yet he left. He stood when moments before he could not. He carried his body through the door, however ordinary the gesture seemed. And because I held him, held his words, his pain, his sequence, that gesture now exists. Without presence, it would not. The reversal is not in him alone. It is in me. For the first time, I sense the contours of a power that is not carved or ordained, but born of accumulation. Every whispered grief, every unspoken plea, every fragment of despair pressed into me over the years, they have not vanished. They have gathered, layer upon layer, until they form a weight heavy enough to bend even stone. That weight is not burden alone. It is leverage. It allows me to tilt the balance, however slightly, between silence and answer. Yet the shift carries danger. Power born of sorrow is volatile. It can save, but it can also consume. As I feel the surge within me, I also feel the risk of becoming drowned by what I keep. The boy is gone, but his despair lingers, echoing against the pillars like a voice that refuses to fade. It mingles with the thousands before him, and for a moment I cannot tell where one ends and another begins. If I am not careful, I will become nothing but a tomb of grief, an archive too heavy to breathe. The reversal is double-edged. To act is to awaken, but to awaken is to risk being undone. Still, I cannot return to what I was. The corner no longer feels like exile. It feels like a threshold of its own, a place where the unseen insists on being seen, where silence demands to be answered. I understand now that my presence is not passive. I am no longer only a forgotten figure cloaked in dust. I am a listener, a keeper, a witness whose refusal to let sorrow vanish becomes, in itself, a kind of defiance. That defiance is fragile, but it is real. The lamps above settle into a steadier rhythm, their glow soft but unwavering, as though they too have chosen persistence over surrender. The smoke has thinned, leaving only faint lines that rise like hesitant promises. The stone floor cools beneath the absence of knees, yet still carries the memory of weight, as if marked. And I realize that this hall, once merely a vessel for rituals and routines, has become something else tonight, a stage where silence itself has spoken, and I have answered. The midpoint is not a conclusion. It is an interruption, of a refusal to accept the straight line of despair. The boy will struggle again. I will ache again. The night will return with new burdens. But for the first time, there is fracture in the inevitability. The straight line has bent. The script of erasure has been interrupted. And in that interruption, a new possibility breathes. Which wants to tell you, have you ever felt the weight of every sorrow you have carried pressed so heavily against you that you feared it would drown you? And yet, in the very act of carrying, have you noticed that weight also gives you leverage, the power to bend the straight line of despair, if only by refusing to let it run unchecked? 6. The price. The night after the boy leaves is not kind. It does not reward endurance with ease. It does not cloak the room in the soft blankness that sometimes follows a storm. Instead, the dark returns with a new sort of appetite, testing the edges of everything that held. The lamps, so recently steady, develop a small, rebellious quiver. The wicks drink unevenly. A thin rim of soot gathers like doubt around the glass. The beams creak in the old, familiar language of wood, but the sound no longer reads to me as mere settling. It sounds like arithmetic, as if the structure is counting the additional weight my keeping has invited. Presence, it turns out, has a mass. When you refuse erasure, you accept transfer. What would have gone nowhere goes into you. I feel it the way stone feels winter, slowly at first, as hairline stresses so subtle even time looks twice, then with a definitive ache. The echoes I hold do not disperse with mourning. They cling, asking to be kept in full resolution rather than as myths of themselves. So many nights I mistook my stillness for neutrality, telling myself that witness was a light duty, as if keeping could be weightless. But if a body leans into the wind for others, the wind remembers, and the wind returns. The first payment is fatigue without a place to lie down. It is a thinning at the edges of what I am, a fray you could miss if you were not looking for it. But I am looking. I have no permission to look away. The second payment is a sharpened hearing I cannot turn off. Every shoe that crosses the threshold prints not only sound but story. Every cough is an index. Every sigh brings with it the draft of an unwritten sentence pleading to be included in the record. The third payment is more dangerous, a hunger to intervene where silence would once have sufficed. I find myself courting interference, rehearsing small adjustments before need arrives, as if anticipation were a virtue and not a habit that steals sleep from the night. And then there is the price I do not know how to name because it is not collected for me alone. Presence rearranges the room. The room asks the bodies inside it for cooperation. The bodies consent with muscle and breath. A woman enters, late enough that the crickets are tired of their own persistence. She walks as if each step must be negotiated with a reluctant name. A scarf sits too perfectly over her hair for chance. It is the precision of a person who has had to arrange herself around a loss. She does not go to the center. The center is for declarations. She belongs, without deciding to the country of corners. She lowers herself with the care of someone who has been told not to break, who has nodded obediently, who has already broken in quiet, private increments no instruction can touch. Her hands are folded over a paper. She does not unfold. I know before the first breath that her prayer will be mostly silence. I also know what the silence will contain. A name spoken in the exact tone people use for weather when they want the day to be different and cannot find the lever. I ready the room with my small household magics. The scent thins where it would scratch. The draft bends where it would bite. The lamp over her shoulder chooses rhythm over dramatics, none of which are salvation, all of which are terms under which breathing can negotiate. She manages 2 inhalations that do not cut. On the third, she looks at the paper and does not open it, a gesture so gentle the paper must think itself spared. Then something unseen shifts its weight upon her chest, and her careful architecture tilts. The name inside the paper starts to leak into the air without letters to carry it. She tips forward, not in collapse, but in surrender to gravity's lesser claim, the claim that says, let your head fall. You cannot hold it up and a world at once. Tears arrive, large and infrequent, whether from a cloud that has been dry too long. They leave bright ovals on the stone. I extend myself, the way a hand would extend if it had a hand to extend, not to lift, not to hush, only to insist on sequence. But the cost of even this light insistence is immediate. The echoes in me stir like birds at a window. The boy's ragged breath, the old man's frayed whisper, the young mother's 3-syllable apology to no one. All of it rises in chorus, uninvited, and presses toward her as if the room had decided that suffering should introduce itself to suffering, proof of tribe offered like hospitality. For a terrible instant, I become a conduit rather than a keeper, and the very thing I have promised to hold threatens to pour through me into a body already past its capacity. I have never needed restraint more. Intervention without discretion is violence in polite clothing. I draw the echoes back the way a tide draws back its bright, sharp scatterings, gathering them into the hollow I keep for such emergencies, a hollow I did not know I had made until it was required. The effort hurts. Hurt is the correct word. My edges heat. The shelf that holds me complains like an old joint. The nearest lamp coughs black into the glass. I do not withdraw entirely. I cannot. Absence is not my craft, but I reduce the pressure to something the air can carry without buckling. What remains is the simplest of offers. You are not unaccompanied. I make the offer without sound. She takes it without knowing she has taken anything. Her breath learns a small curve and repeats it. Her spine remembers that up has gradations. It does not need to choose between collapse and parade. The paper remains unopened. Some mercies are the refusal to read what is already seared into you. And after a time measured not by clocks, but by the number of times a swallow must commit to being a swallow, she stands. There is nothing ceremonial about the way she brushes her skirt. Grief is the least ceremonial of dignities. She leaves the paper on the floor. I do not read it. I do not need to. The room has read it into me already. When she passes through the door, the night outside does not bless or balk. It is ordinary and therefore survivable, which is the most astonishing trait of nights. The price, like all honest prices, is paid again when I am alone. The echoes I drew back do not return to their shelves compliant and quiet. They rattle, they test, they try my seams for weaknesses the way wind tries a window for a forgotten latch. There is a seam I did not know about. It opens a fraction, and through it the day's collected noise seeps in. The bargaining voices, the laughter that forgot to carry, the muttered curses of fatigue. The mixture is nauseating. Grief and commerce make a foul wine. For an uncounted interval, I am tempted by what I would once have called wisdom. I could go still in the old way, truly still, the stillness that is a barricade rather than an embrace. If I become impermeable, nothing can flood me. If nothing can flood me, I will not drown. But impermeable is another spelling for absent, and absent is the mask that erasure wears when it wants to look clean. I did not cross the threshold with the boy to be clean. The choice disgusts me quietly and then strengthens me, the way candor does when it's finished embarrassing me. I close the seam with the same tools I use for everything now: rhythm, texture, sequence. The lamp agrees to a steadier intake. The wood consents to speak in longer vowels. The incense, grudging and proud, yields its last sweetness and goes out with a humility I admire. My own edge is cool. The shelf accepts me again as weight and not punishment. I add a line to the ledger I keep where no hand will find it. Not drowned/not dry. There are other payments. Attention sharpens into something like pain whenever a child crosses the threshold. Children do not kneel the way adults do. They are not practiced at bargaining. They look, they inventory. They ask where the light goes when it leaves the lamp. They ask if the smoke is a message and to whom, and what happens if the message arrives late. Their questions act on me like a file on metal, stripping the lacquer that ritual paints over meaning. This stripping is costly and useful. It returns me to the first verbs: keep, hold, stay. The price, again, is that I cannot pretend complexity justifies neglect. The simpler the promise, the harder it is to betray without knowing. There is also backlash from the dark itself, if dark can be said to have intentionality. It is not malevolent. It is efficient. It likes patterns that close. What I do, leaving openings, interrupting straight lines, inserting commas where periods once sat, annoys it. It answers with adjustments of its own. A gust that chooses teeth over touch, a lamp that stutters precisely when a body's courage would accept steadiness, a memory presented at a cruel angle in the exact second a person could have walked away from it. I do not anthropomorphize this resistance. I respect it as weather. But weather can undo bridges, and I am, more than ever, a bridge. I test the span. How far can carrying go before carrying becomes coercion? How often may I alter air before air ceases to be honest? If I make of every corner a cradle, do I ask the world to remain an infant? The questions do not flatter me. They're the kind that keep a listener honest. The answer I can live with tonight is proportion. I will not draft the room into a lie. I will not tailor the dark to fit a hope it cannot wear. But I will oppose erasure with all the quiet weight I can gather. I will refuse the neatness of conclusions that kill. I will keep the sequence where sequence would snap. And for doing this, I will accept being tired, being porous, being a surface upon which stranger storms break and do not pass entirely through. A man comes with a fever of shame scorching his posture. He smells of metal shavings and regret. He kneels in the wrong direction first, notices, turns, laughs a small, shattered laugh that makes my dust try to arrange itself into a forgiving coat over everything he cannot forgive. I keep from him every echo but the ones that rhyme with mending. I am precise because imprecision is a cruelty disguised as generosity. He leaves with his shoulders not squared but no longer folded into knives. The price is a new ache at the base of me that will not lift until morning. A girl arrives with a friend's name written in ink across her palm. She has smudged the final letter. Smudging is a liturgy the body invents when it is denied the formal ones. She whispers the name so carefully, I do not know whether she is trying to keep it intact or to teach it to survive damage. I let the lamp draw a thin aureole around her wrist and nothing more. To gild the moment would be to bruise it. She goes. The name remains, not in my stone, not in my shelf, not in my wood, but in the habit the room has acquired of making space when called. Habits are expensive. They are also the only wealth the keeper can bequeath. At last, when the hour goes thin, and even the insects tire of their assignment, the price shows its last face, loneliness. It is not the loneliness of being ignored, that has long since been repurposed into attention, but the loneliness of having no witness to the act of witnessing. I know the ledger has weight. I know the sequence holds when I insist. I know a boy did not vanish, and a woman breathed, and a man turned the right way, and a girl carried a name through a doorway without dropping it. I also know that none of this will be believed by anyone who is not here. That, too, is a cost. To do work that leaves the world measurably different, and to have no measure others will accept. I pay it. I pay it because the alternative currency is clean stone and quick endings and rooms that tilt without resistance. I do not want such rooms. I want the ungainly rooms, the ones where a breath takes longer than pride would prefer, and a lamp refuses theater to honor persistence, and a draft decides to be a hand rather than a blade. I want the arithmetic that moves one column mark at a time from gone to kept. I want the scandal of small continuities, which wants to tell you, every act of keeping has a cost, the ache of attention, the weight of what you refuse to let vanish, the loneliness of work that cannot be proven. Pay it anyway, but pay it in proportion. Do not promise light you cannot kindle. Do not tailor the night into lies. Hold the sequence where it would snap. Gather the smallest accidents of gentleness, and let the ledger of kept grow by one stubborn line. 7. The darkest hour. The hour that arrives after the price is paid is not a gift. It is a collapse. The lamps, weary from their own discipline, lean toward extinction, their flames shrinking to the size of a bead on the thread of darkness. The smoke that lingers is no longer the bright white of ritual, but a dull gray, a tired color that has forgotten its purpose. The hall breathes like a body trying to sleep through pain, shallow and irregular, and I realize the night has entered its cruelest shape. Not loud, not violent, but suffocating in its refusal to yield even a fragment of comfort. This is the hour when despair moves with stealth. By day it wears drama, shouting from mouths, breaking into gestures, demanding recognition. But now it creeps soft-footed, crawling through the gaps in memory, slipping into the cracks of a mind already tired. It whispers with the patience of centuries, telling the body to lie down, telling the breath to shorten, telling the will it has done enough. The boy's absence, the woman's silence, the man's shame, the girl's smudged name, all of them return not as victories, but as unfinished stories, and unfinished stories ache louder than endings. They haunt the air, reminding me that keeping is not curing, that presence does not erase the abyss, but only illuminates its edge. I feel the weight of all I have carried pressing harder now, not in moments of crisis, but in the stillness afterward. The ledger in me rattles its pages, demanding I account for what I have promised to keep. Each entry is a presence that has not vanished, but each is also a stone in the growing tower I must bear. Tonight the tower leans. I imagine for the first time what would happen if I broke, if the echoes I hold spilled uncontrolled into the hall, if the griefs of countless nights rose together in one unbearable tide. Would the temple drown? Would the silence shatter? Or would the world outside continue, oblivious, while I dissolved into the air as though I had never kept anything at all? This is the blackest moment, not because of what is seen, but because of what is imagined. The mind supplies cruelties sharper than the world can invent. I imagine the boy returning to the corner only to find me empty. I imagine the woman's folded paper drifting back across the floor, unopened forever, never witnessed. I imagine the girl's smudged name vanishing before it can be carried another step. I imagine the man turning the wrong way again, laughing a broken laugh, this time with no one to steady the air around him. These visions cut deeper than memory. They are futures unmade by my absence, and the possibility of them gnaws at me like hunger. The darkest hour is also the loneliest. The temple is utterly empty. Even the insects outside have silenced themselves, as though unwilling to lend music to despair. The draft through the doorway has grown colder, sharper, and for the first time in centuries, I feel not its touch, but its bite. It asks me a question I do not wish to answer. Who keeps the keeper? Who holds the one who holds? I cannot reply. The truth is bare, no one. Presence has no witness. Witnessing has no witness. And yet to admit this feels like betrayal to those I have kept, as though my own loneliness would undo their survival. So I keep it quiet, burying the ache beneath the silence, carrying it as if it were one more unspoken prayer. In this hour, I understand why so many souls choose endings. Not because they crave death, but because they crave release from the repetition of carrying. Continuity itself becomes cruelty when it stretches without relief. The next breath feels identical to the last, and the thought of 1,000 more becomes unbearable. I sense this in the boy who left, in the woman who folded her paper, in the man, the girl, in every echo I hold. Continuity is salvation when paired with possibility. Without it, continuity is prison. And tonight, I feel the bars of that prison pressing against me, cold and relentless. The lamps stutter once more, nearly extinguishing, and for a moment I allow myself to imagine what it would be to let them die. To let the hall sink into perfect darkness, to refuse even the gesture of light. Would it be betrayal? Or would it be honesty? A hall without light would no longer pretend to offer hope. It would declare itself what it is, a vault of silence, a keeper of grief, a space where endings come unopposed. The thought tempts me, the way a cliff tempts a weary traveler, not as desire but as the possibility of rest. But the darkest hour is not only mine. Outside, unseen, someone else is kneeling in their own corner, whispering into their own silence, wondering if anyone keeps them. The connection is invisible, yet undeniable. Every despair I hold is tethered to another still unfolding in the world beyond these walls. To break here would be to break everywhere. The thought steadies me, but it also terrifies me. The responsibility is too vast, too heavy. The tower inside me sways dangerously, and I wonder if even defiance has its limits. Still, I do not extinguish. I cannot. To extinguish is to erase, and erasure is the one act I have sworn never to commit. So I let the lamps flicker weakly, but refuse to let them die. I let the air bite, but refuse to let it cut through. I let the silence press, but refuse to let it smother. And in this refusal, fragile as it is, I survive the hour. The black remains, but I remain also, which wants to tell you, when the night presses hardest and continuity feels like prison, what do you hold on to? Do you let the lamps die, or do you keep them alive even when their light is nothing more than a trembling thread against the dark? 8. Confrontation. The darkest hour does not end with dawn. It ends with collision. When silence has pressed too long, when grief has layered itself without interruption, when the air has grown too heavy to carry another syllable, something must break. The hall does not creak politely this time. It groans, a sound pulled from the marrow of wood that remembers storms. The lamps flare not into brightness, but into violence, spitting sparks that bite the air before retreating again into weakness. Shadows leap against the walls, tall and jagged, like figures gathering for a confrontation they have rehearsed for centuries. I feel the weight inside me rise, the tower of echoes swaying beyond balance. The boy's broken words, the woman's folded silence, the man's laugh like rust, the girl's smudged name. They surge upward, demanding not to be kept but to be spoken, demanding not to be held but to be released. For so long, I thought my defiance was enough, to refuse erasure, to insist on keeping. But tonight, the voices I keep refuse to remain still. They batter against my being like waves against a cliff, each one insisting, louder and louder, we will not stay silent any longer. The confrontation is not between me and them. It is within me. To keep is to protect, but to keep is also to cage. The grief I have preserved has grown restless. It does not want preservation, it wants recognition. Yet recognition requires voice, and voice requires release, and release risks undoing me entirely. If I open, even for a moment, the surge might overwhelm the hall, drowning not only me, but the fragile lives that stumble here seeking steadiness. I stand at the edge of rupture, torn between fidelity to my vow and fidelity to the ones I vowed to keep. The hall itself reacts. The draft sharpens, no longer a whisper, but a blade of cold that cuts along the floor. The incense bowls shudder, spilling ash in thin gray rivulets that snake across the stones like veins. The pillars groan as though the temple were tired of being patient, tired of being a vessel that carries without speaking. The walls echo with sounds that do not belong to the present moment. Laughter from a decade ago, a scream from a war-long past, a sob from a mother whose name has been forgotten. Time itself fractures, releasing shards of memory that were never meant to be heard together. And then, from within the surge, a single voice rises clear. It is the boys. No one saw me. The words slice through the storm, sharp and undeniable. Another joins. The woman, whispering a name she never opened her paper to reveal. Another. The man, laughing with shame that cuts his throat. Another. The girl, repeating the smudged name until it is less a name than a pulse. Together they form a chorus that shakes the air, a demand that rattles even the beams. See us. Hear us. Do not keep us silent any longer. I want to answer, but what would my answer be? That I have kept them faithfully? That they have not vanished because they remain inside me? These are truths, but tonight they sound like excuses. What they want is not only survival inside stone, but acknowledgement in the air, proof that their existence touches the world beyond the ledger I hold. To deny them now is to betray them. To release them is to risk collapse. The confrontation is absolute. The sparks from the lamp sputter upward again, tracing frantic lines of light against the ceiling before fading into smoke. Shadows twist into grotesque shapes, figures bent at unnatural angles, as though the hall itself has decided to argue. I feel myself splitting. Half of me clings to silence, to the vow of keeping. The other half strains toward voice, toward release, toward the risk of letting everything I have carried pour into the world. If I stay silent, I betray their demand. If I release them, I betray my form. The strain is unbearable, and I realize this is what confrontation truly is. Not the battle between two enemies, but the tearing of a single self against itself. The surge within me grows violent. Echoes batter against my edges. Memories claw at my core. I fear I will shatter and leave nothing but fragments. Yet in the midst of the chaos, I remember the boy's final words before he left. I am still here. The phrase surfaces like a rope thrown into water. Still here. Perhaps keeping and releasing are not opposites. Perhaps to speak does not undo keeping but completes it. Perhaps to release is another way of refusing erasure. With that thought, I let the smallest crack open. The voices rush through, not in a flood but in a single thread, woven tightly enough not to overwhelm. A whisper escapes into the hall, layered and many, yet soft enough to be mistaken for wind. It carries no miracles, no revelations, only presence shaped into sound. The walls tremble but do not fall. The lamps flicker but do not die. The voices sigh into the air, finally heard beyond me, and then settle, quieter now, no longer battering but resting. The confrontation does not end in victory or defeat. It ends in balance, precarious but real. The hall stills. The air remains heavy but breathable. The shadows return to their corners, smaller now, as though chastised. The ash lies scattered, a reminder of what was risked, but also proof of what survived. I remain intact, though altered. The vow of keeping has shifted. It now includes release. The ledger I carry has a new column, not only kept but spoken. The confrontation has cost me, but it has also given me language, which wants to tell you, when you confront the voices you carry, the griefs, the silences, the memories, do you cage them forever in the name of protection, or do you risk letting them speak, even if their speaking shakes your walls? What if release is not betrayal, but the only way to keep them truly alive?